Chapter 14 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. The performance of the organ works. How did Bach play his organ works, and how should they be played? This practical question is much more important than the historical and aesthetic question. Upon the performance it depends whether these works can really be brought home to the hearers, or whether they are simply to be admired in a kind of respectful wonder, their beauty being taken on trust rather than actually felt. This certainly happens frequently at the present day. Indications for performance are scarce in Bach's work. Once or twice, as in the D minor toccata, Peters III, No. 3, the changes of manual are indicated. In the Orgelbewegung we are expressly told which pieces are to be played on two keyboards. In the Schubler chorale trios we are told whether 8 or 4 or 16 feet stops are to be drawn. Peters VII, Nos. 38, 57, 59 and 63. That is practically all. We know from Walther's copy Bach's manner of playing the chorale prelude, Eine feste Burg, Peters VI, No. 22, at the opening of the new organ at Mühlhausen. His unfriendly critic Scheibe informs us that his manner at the organ was extraordinarily quiet. Forkel says that he astonished other organists by the audacity of his tone combinations. Otherwise, he was distinguished from his contemporaries only by his consistent pursuit of the principle of legato playing. He had no experience of the Venetian shutter swell, which was introduced about that time in England, where Handel took great interest in the invention. In Germany, the opposition to this so-called trifling lasted a long time. When Burney, more than 20 years after Bach's death, heard the Berlin organs, he was astonished to find that not one composed a swell. It no more occurred to Bach than to the rest of his contemporaries that some day organs would be fitted with combination stops, adjustable combinations, and all the rest of the apparatus of the modern organs, especially the so-called concert organs. How do we stand now with regard to the performance of Bach's work on the modern organ? We have achieved infinite possibilities in registration, the power of gradual variation from pianissimo to fortissimo, and by means of the swells a certain power of tone nuance. But we have lost the old tone of the organ, that Bach wrote for, and since the tone is the chief thing, it must be said that the modern organ is not so suitable for Bach playing as it is generally supposed. Our registers are all voiced too loudly or too softly. If we pull out the whole of the diapasons and the mixtures, or add the reeds, we get a force of tone that in the end becomes positively unbearable. The lighter manuals are weak in comparison with the great organ, they usually lack the necessary mixtures. Our pedals are coarse and clumsy, and also poor in mixtures as well as in 4-feet stops. The trouble comes principally from the change in the disposition of the organs. The relation between diapasons and mixtures have been altered wholly to the detriment of the latter, but also from the unnaturally strong bellows of the modern organ. In our passion for strength of tone, we have forgotten beauty and richness of tone, which depend upon the harmonious blending of ideally voiced stops. The older organs are becoming scarcer and scarcer. There are many organists today who have never heard Bach played on the kind of organ the composer had in view when he wrote. The day is not far distant when the last of our beautiful Silbermann organs will be replaced or renovated beyond recognition, and then the Bach organ will be one of the unknown things of the past, like certain orchestral instruments that he uses in his scores. If we play Bach on an old and well-preserved Silbermann organ, both players and hearers are as little conscious as the master himself was of the need for frequent changes of register, for on such an instrument the diapasons and mixtures give a forte so rich, intense, full-colored, and yet in no wise fatiguing, that we can, if need be, preserve it unchanged throughout a prelude or a fugue. On such an organ, moreover, both the inner parts and the pedal come out clearly, whereas on the modern organ the inner parts are confused, and the pedal, by reason of its deficiency in 4-feet stops and mixtures, and its inferiority in weight to the enormous masses of tone above it, cannot, even at its most brutal, throw out a clear line. And all this on account of the too heavy voicing of our registers. The organs of 40 years ago that are voiced with a normal pressure, for the simple reason that at that time the electric bellows was unknown, and the wind was consequently sparingly used, are better Bach organs than the modern ones. What a joy it is, for example, to play Bach on the beautiful Walker organs built between about 1860 and 1875. As a rule, Bach kept to the characteristic registration with which he began, getting variety and gradation in his playing by transitions from one manual to another. It is noteworthy, however, that he played a great many organ pieces throughout on the great organ without any change whatever of manuals and without any gradation of tone, the essence of them being the evolution of a single idea, free from any dramatic suggestions. This is especially the case with the works in which the pedal is employed uninterruptedly throughout. For example, the two preludes in C major, Peters II, numbers 1 and 7, and A major, 2, number 3, respectively. The majority of the chorales of the Orgelbewegung, and both the larger and smaller ones in the fugal style of Pachelbel. Here any variation of tone color or alternation of strong and weak would destroy the ideal unity of the work. The organ sonatas in trio form, again, are most effective when the tone color that has been found to be the best for each of the three obbligato parts is maintained throughout. As regards the choice of tone colors, it need only be said that these are sufficiently Bachian when they suit the character of the work. We must not grudge even months of trouble in order to find the right registration. It is still disputable what is meant by the expression organo pleno that often figures at the head of a work. It practically amounts to this, that in passages of this kind Bach desires the main strength of the organ, at any rate diapasons and mixtures. On present-day organs, however, this must be done with discretion. The tutti of the diapasons and mixtures, thanks to the disagreeably sound quality of the latter, hardly correspond to what Bach had in his mind. Should we also use the reeds in Bach's preludes and fugues? His objection to those usually found in modern organs would have been that they are too blaring and that they obscure the polyphony. On the other hand, it is probable that he added reeds to his diapasons and mixtures, for he cultivates the metallic tone in the orchestra as well. His pedal timbre was really based on reeds. Moreover, we know how highly he valued good reeds in an organ. What we have to do in future is to restore the old, delicate and beautiful reeds, then just add a lustre to the diapasons without overwhelming them as ours do. Until then we must manage with compromise, and use diapasons, mixtures, and reeds with sufficient discretion to get something like the old quality of tone. It is interesting to note that Bach's contemporaries complained that the Silbermann brothers voiced their organs too softly, in order to get beauty of tone. Bach evidently did not think so. The effect that can be made with a fine full fortissimo combining all the timbres may be seen in the little prelude in E minor, Peters III, number 10. If we play it right through without any change, we realize at once that this is how Bach conceived it, and that to play it with any variation of color or of force is to destroy its dramatic majesty. We play the chorale preludes of the Orgelbewegung and many others too softly, again, because we do not make sufficient use of beautiful mixtures on the secondary manuals, which would not only sound well in themselves, but would permit the use also of one or two reeds. We are thus thrown back, as a rule, on the characterless tone color of some 8-feet diapasons, which particularly obscure the polyphonic writing. The 4-feet and 2-feet are also generally voiced too strongly. And we try to make up in sentimentality for what we have lost in richness and quality of tone. It is obviously wrong, for we lose the simple effect of the cantus firmus. We should carefully consider which chorales are written for two and which for one manual, and not plume ourselves on our cleverness when we play the latter on two manuals. Bach's own intentions can always be gathered from the style of writing. A part that he intended for one manual cannot be played upon two without seriously marring the grouping and leading of the voices. Conversely, a work conceived for two manuals is written in such a way that each part lies smoothly and clearly on its own manual down to the smallest detail. This principle can be applied to all organ works. If the cantus firmus is broken up into coloratura, as in the chorale preludes in Bohm's manner, it often comes out to particular advantage with an oboe or clarinet coloring. Wonderful effects of blending can be obtained by using a small mixture in the swell and adding diapasons and an oboe coloring to it. These chorale preludes in Bohm's style should be played the most delicately of all. The pedal should not be too heavy, and at any rate in the chorale preludes uncoupled wherever possible. It is most effective with its own stops. Frequently, only an 8-feet tone should be employed. For example, in the chorale preludes Olam Gottes, Peter V, number 44, and Gottes Sohn ist kommen, Peters V, number 19. At other times, even only a 4-feet tone is suitable. For example, in Il Dulci Giubilo, Peters V, number 35, where the double pedal is prescribed throughout. It goes without saying that only 8-feet stops should be employed, with the 4 feet for stronger effects. This rule is frequently disregarded. The case is different when the double pedal is used at the end of a work. Example, in the D major prelude, Peters 4, No. 3. Here the 16 feet is to be maintained, though it must be admitted that the fortissimo of a modern pedal of this kind is far from charming. The organist should not worry either himself or his hearers too much with the working out of a canonic passage. The piece is not there for the sake of the canon, but the canon for the sake of the piece, especially in the canons of the Orgelbewegung. If we hear properly the melody of the cantus firmus, the other parts can be so far kept in the background that the uninitiated need not even suspect there is a canon in progress. In chorales to be played on two manuals, experience teaches us that as a rule it is better to let the string character prevail in the left hand and a flute color in the upper parts, this color being free from harshness there but muddy in the lower register. Special difficulties are offered by the two great chorales with double pedal, An-Wasserflüchen Babylon, Peters 6, No. 122, and Austeifer Not Schrei ich zu dir, Peters 6, No. 13. For the first following registration is recommended. Strings in the pedal, in the left hand flutes, in the right hand strings, all soft 8 feet stops. The chorale prelude Austeifer Not is very effective when the whole 8 and 4 feet register, diapasons, mixtures and reeds is used in the pedal. In this way the mixtures and reeds, which are often missing, can be got from the second and third manuals by coupling, and we can play the 4 upper parts on the great organ with the full 8 and 4 feet diapasons, even adding a good mixture later on. This solves the problem of bringing out the cantus firmus clearly in the upper pedal part. Under certain circumstances it is as well to omit the 8 feet trumpet and to employ only the 4 feet stops for the reed timbre. In truth, however, we can only play these double pedal parts quite legato, either on the old narrow Bach pedals or the curved French and English pedals with their circular arrangement. It is impossible on the flat and excessively broad pedal keyboard that is regarded as the only correct thing in Germany. The foregoing remarks apply to the works that seem to call for neither a change of manuals nor a change of color. As a rule, however, Bach goes on the presupposition that we shall play his works with the variety suggested by their contents and their style of treatment. He gives no indication on the point, simply because the works carry their own indications. Leading parts on the grand organ, subsidiary parts, generally recognizable by the omission of the pedal on the supplementary manuals, this is what he expects from the player. This can be seen from the D minor toccata, Peters 3, No. 3, in which he has specified the changes of manual, probably for a pupil. In the chorale on Ein fester Burg, Peters 6, No. 22, we can reconstruct Bach's registration from Walter's copy. His indications evidently refer to the Mulhausen organ, the renovation of which Bach superintended, and which he opened in all its new glory in the autumn of 1709, perhaps at the Reformation feast. First of all, bars 1 to 20, Bach kept the right hand on the second manual, employing among others the sesquialtera, and the left hand on the first manual, defining the tone quality of his by the fagotto 16 inches. Bar 20 to 24 he played on the third manual, drawing the soft pedal stops, especially the new sub-bass. During this he strengthened somewhat the other manuals, and came back to them in bars 24 to 32, in which the assistant, probably Walter, took advantage of the short pause in the bass in bar 24 to draw the full pedal. In bars 32 to 37, Bach returned to the third manual, the assistant shutting off the strong pedal registers. The finale, from bar 37, was played on the great organ with all the stops. The registration of the piece could not be simpler or more effective. These two examples show us how ingeniously Bach managed the changes of manual. The first thing, therefore, is always to look for the simple architectural lines of the work. The registration that brings these out is the right one. Any other, no matter how ingenious it may be, is less good, in that it obscures the real configuration of the work. We must keep to the principle that every fugue and every prelude is to begin and end on the great organ. It is quite wrong to give out a fugal theme piano or pianissimo, and let each voice as it enters take it up more loudly. The theme, whether joyous or sad, must always be given out with a certain fullness of tone, leaving the cumulative effect to come from the entries of the different voices. It is painful to hear themes that should enter proudly, like those of the A minor and G minor fugues, given out softly on the third manual in a way that quite obscures their real character, all for the sake of the precious crescendo. In many a fugue the whole architectural effect is sacrificed to the desire to render the theme always fully audible, to which end it and the other voices are transferred from the great organ to one of the others. This is unpermissible. Now and again we hear a Bach fugue played in such a way that it tapers off at the end in the most beautiful pianissimo. This modernization is partly the product of our present-day way of looking at music. If our organists wish to prove themselves modern musicians, it can only be by transferring the modern orchestral style to these works. They forget that Bach's own orchestral style was the ancient one, not the modern. The effects he aimed at on the organ are the same that he aspires after in the Brandenburg concertos. The organist, therefore, would be well advised to study these works thoroughly in order to penetrate to the secret of Bach's style and to realize that with him it is a question not so much of a gradual cumulation of effect as of the lucid opposition and combination of two or three bodies of tone. For this reason, the modern swell really does our organists a disservice, in that it is always tempting them to indulge in these gradual crescendi. The true cumulative effects in Bach are made by the entry at definite moments of two or three new tone masses, and the decrescendo by their departure. On the other hand, the constitution of our organs that are incapable of the real Bach forte, and in which the polyphonic writing does not come out clearly, makes us have recourse to artificial effects instead of natural ones, and we try to make Bach interesting by variations of tone and of color and by an over-insistence on the theme. Here also, until we begin building ideal Bach organs again, we must resort to a wise compromise. This does not mean that the gradual rise and fall of tone, effected on a small scale by means of the Venetian shutter swell and on a large scale by means of the cylinder, is always wrong in Bach. Archaistic tendencies should not be tolerated in music. Bach would have been the last to set his face against new methods. Many passages, for example the conclusion of the A minor fugue, really demand an increase in the forte itself. And how happy Bach would have been could he have got a finer piano on his third manual by shutting off some of the wind, as is possible by means of the Venetian shutter swell. To refuse to make use of this device in the great episode in the A minor fugue, beginning at the 51st bar, employing first a decrescendo, then a crescendo, is to be false to Bach. Only the present-day organist must make use of the device in such a way as not to disturb the original architecture of the fugue, and be sure that the various episodes of the work come out simply and clearly. Within these limits he may do what he thinks necessary. If this principle is generally recognized, there will be an end of much of the modern pretentious virtuosity in the performance of Bach's organ works, and people will come back from the art that merely stimulates interest to the art that satisfies. And then the hearers will realize that Bach's organ works are not complicated, but extremely simple. Organists should particularly avoid the sudden decrescendo in the cadences that has gradually become the fashion under the seductive influence of the cylinder swell. It is to be hoped also that some day the practice will cease of employing the cylinder swell at the beginning of the F major toccata, instead of starting with a good forte and leaving the crescendo to the dramatic unfolding of the canon. For the rest, this toccata is one of the works that are most effective when played simply with various nuances of the one forte. The works differ greatly with regard to the changes of manual they require. In many, these changes amount merely to an occasional bar or two on the subsidiary manuals. We may even doubt whether Bach went to these manuals in the bars where the pedal ceases, for example, in the C major fugue, Peters II, No. 1. Usually, however, the changes are so important that we cannot be in doubt as to where the intermezzo begins on the secondary manual and where it ends. In a number of fugues, the change comes exactly in the middle, so that they appear to be triform both in structure and performance. 1. The first exposition on the great organ. 2. The intermezzo. 3. A second exposition extending to the final cadence. Of this kind are the fugues in G major, 2, No. 2, C major, 2, No. 7, F major, 3, No. 2, A minor, 2, No. 8, G minor, 2, No. 4, and B minor, 2, No. 10. The intermezzo on the subsidiary manuals begins each time at the place where the pedal ceases, or shortly afterwards, and ends at the re-entry of the pedal, or shortly before. Instead of one big crescendo lasting from the beginning to the end, as we moderns conceive the fugue as Bach conceived it consisted of two equipolant main sections with a subsidiary section between them. To destroy the character of the intermezzo is to destroy the Bach fugue. The most striking fugues in respect of this simple structure are the three just mentioned, in A minor, G minor, and B minor. Here we clearly realize the necessity of a diminuendo up to a certain point in the intermezzo. The theme retires to some extent into the innermost and uppermost parts of the organ, there to evolve slowly, until the time comes for the re-entry of the pedal, signalized by a return to the tone color that prevailed at the commencement of the intermezzo when the pedal ceased. How the organist manages this, how he passes from one manual to another, how he introduces mixtures and reeds into the diapasons and takes them out again, and brings out this architecture even down to the smallest detail, that is his affair. He will have to be ruled by the disposition of his organ. The chief thing is for him to recognize the plan of the fugue and bring this out, not a fantastic plan of his own invention. Other fugues exhibit two or more changes. There are two in the following fugues: A major, Peters II, number 3, bars 59 to 87 and 121 to 146. F minor 2, number 5, bars 43 to 64 and 96 to 120. C minor 2, number 6, bars 50 to 94 and 118 to 143. C minor 3, number 6, bars 27 to 50 and 58 to 67. E minor 3, number 10, bars 15 to 19 and 27 to 33. We meet with more than two intermezzi in the great E minor fugue, Peters II, number 9, that has indeed more the character of a fantasia. It can be properly played only on an organ whose subsidiary manuals are so supplied with mixtures that they do not contrast too markedly with the great organ. The sections dominated by the main theme and the quaver figures are to be played wholly on the great organ, and the passages with the semi-quaver figures on the subordinate manuals. The charm depends each time upon the immediate entry of the chief theme and the quaver movement. Here one doubly regrets that Bach has not recorded the change of manuals. An excellent plan is to play the great semi-quaver figures in which the pedal shares on the first manual without its own mixtures, but adding those of the other manuals by means of the couplers, and then, at each return of the main theme, bring in the mixtures and finally the reeds of the great organ. The prelude in E flat major, 3, number 1, which is similarly constructed, must be played in the same way. The triple fugue appended to it is the most effective when we play the first part with the full diapasons of the great organ, perhaps with delicate mixtures of the other manuals coupled to them. The second part on the subsidiary manuals with all the mixtures, and in the third part return to the first manual, which has meanwhile been increased to fortissimo. In a number of preludes in which the pedal is used throughout, it is as well to work on a basis of varied fortes, relieved one against the other by the intensity of the mixture tone obtained by adding the coupled manuals to the full diapasons. For the G minor fantasia, 2, number 4, we would propose at the commencement the 3 coupled manuals, diapasons, mixtures and reeds, in bars 9 to 14, retain only the diapasons. From bar 14 onwards add gradually each time on the strong beat of the bar, first of all the mixtures, then the reeds in the order 3, 2, 1. In bar 25, take them all off again, so that bars 25 to 31 are played only with the diapason tone color, of course on the great organ. In bar 31, introduce into the diapason mass, first of all the mixtures and reeds on the third manual, 2 bars later those on the second, and 2 bars further on those on the first, until the fortissimo is reached, which is then retained to the end. This method, by which the player always keeps to the same manual, is perhaps less interesting than many of the modern virtuoso methods. It has, however, the advantage of presenting the work to the hearer in all its grand simplicity. This gradated forte can be employed with the same good effect in the preludes in C minor, 2, number 6, and E minor, 2, number 9, only that here, in the section without pedal, there are episodes that need to be played on the subsidiary manuals. The fantasia in C minor, 3, number 6, is the despair of every organist. It is almost impossible to reproduce its ideal beauty in material tone. After every attempt we come back to the simplest method, that consists in the beginning with a flexible diapason basis, introducing at the transition from bar 11 to bar 12 almost all the diapasons and mixtures of the subsidiary manuals, returning in bar 21 to the first diapason color, maintaining this until bar 32, and then gradually introducing, till the end is reached, the whole of the diapasons of the full organ and the mixtures of the subsidiary manuals. One of the works that suffers most at the hands of organists is the B minor prelude, 2, number 10, although its structure is the simplest possible. We should begin on the great organ. At bar 17, go to the subsidiary manuals. In bar 27, the right hand returns to the great organ, followed by the left in bar 28. Both remain there until bar 43, and then move to the other manuals until bar 50, when they again return to the first manual. From bars 56 to 60, keep to the great organ, but retain only the diapasons. During bar 60, introduce mixtures and afterwards reeds under the cover of the chromatic passage. Maintain this on the great organ until bar 69, when we again take off the mixture and the reeds and continue with the diapasons. In bar 73, we come back for the last time to the subsidiary manuals, which we dexterously bring up to fortissimo, and return in the course of bars 78 and 79 to the great organ with all its stops drawn. In the passacaglia, it is very effective to give out the theme with the complete diapasons of the organ coupled to the pedal, and then to begin pianissimo on the third manual and to draw more stops at each new variation. In bar 73, we may perhaps go to the first manual. In the four variations that follow, we may introduce by degrees the whole of the diapasons and mixtures, and finally some reeds. In bar 105, we go to the second manual, and afterwards to the third, taking off the mixtures and reeds. From bar 114 onwards, we close the swell box slowly. The arpeggio passages are played with the fine 8, 4, and 2 feet registers of the third manual. On the last beat of bar 129, we revert to the diapasons and mixtures of the first manual. In the following variations, we add reeds and mixtures of the other manuals. Finally, we add also the reeds of the first manual. To ascertain whether the change of manual can be made, and the way in which it can best be effected, we must endeavour, by continual study of the work, to discover the ground principles on which it is constructed. The great art consists in going back with both hands to the great organ at the moment of the pedal entry. From the structure of the passage, we must try to infer whether we must go to the first manual with one hand after the other, in which case it is always best to begin with the left, since this can enter almost imperceptibly in the lower part, or whether Bach demands a decided contrast, for which we must bring both hands simultaneously to the great organ. His own playing must have been characterized by extraordinary refinement, since he expressly desires that the manuals shall lie quite close to each other, so that he may easily pass from one to the other. There are many critical passages in which sustained notes or harmonies have to be taken with perfect smoothness of transition on another manual. For changes of manual in accordance with Bach's intentions, a certain homogeneous tone color must unite the three manuals. On the organs of today, that have scarcely any mixture on the subsidiary manuals, this is often difficult. It is also regrettable that on our organs the three manuals no longer represent three different and sharply characterized qualities of tone. Hence the main effect of the change of manuals and of the coupling and uncoupling of them is lost. This causes the organ virtuosi of today to renounce the most natural means of effect and have recourse to the cylinder swell that finally becomes so monotonous. If the vital question in Bach playing is that of the coupling and uncoupling of the manuals and of the entries and exits of different tone groups, it must be said that the plan of our modern organs does not lend itself greatly to this. The couplers are worked by the pressing of knobs, which means that the player cannot make full use of them, since in Bach playing neither hand can be dispensed with. Further, our combination stops and adjustable combinations usually work in such a way that they interfere with the existing registration instead of reinforcing it, and they often have the further disadvantage of not acting separately on each manual but on the whole organ. The console ought to be so arranged that the couplers can be worked either by the hand or the foot, the two mechanisms of course being connected. The player could then draw the coupler with his hand and release it with his foot, and vice versa. Or he could employ only the hand or only the foot as suited him best. The collective stops and adjustable combinations should be arranged on a double principle, so that at the will of the organist they could either suspend or supplement the drawn stops. It would be an advantage if they could also be worked both by the hand and the foot. This would imply another much-needed simplification of our organs. It looks as if Bach's works were destined not only to instruct the organist, but to reform the organ builders of the present day, to emancipate us from the folly of the inventor and lead us back from the complicated to the simple, from the strong-toned organ to the organ of rich and beautiful tone. The more we play Bach's organ works, the slower we take the tempi. Every organist has this experience. The lines must stand out in calm plasticity. There must be a time also to bring out their dovetailing and juxtaposition. At the first impression of obscurity and confusion, the whole effect of the organ piece is gone. If so many organists imagine that they play Bach interestingly by taking him fast, this is because they have not mastered the art of playing plastically, so as to give vitality to the work by bringing out its detail clearly. It is quite a mistaken idea that what Bach chiefly wants is a monotonous smoothness. He certainly favored the legato style, but his legato is not a mere leveling. It is alive. It must be filled by a fine phrasing which the hearer need not perceive as such, but of which he is conscious as a captivating lucidity in the playing. Within the legato, the separate tones must be grouped into living phrases. This intimate style of phrasing breaks up the stiffness of the organ tone. The effect should be as if what is impossible on the organ has become possible. That is to say, that some notes have a heavy and others a light touch. That is the ideal to be aimed at. In the old days, when the absolutely uniform legato obtained by passing under the thumb was not known, so that only a few of the notes were played legato, while the others were detached owing to the displacement of the hand, players had a feeling for the artistic grouping of notes within a legato that we have lost, but of which we can form a rough idea by observing how, at that time, runs were divided between the two hands. Even in the introduction to the C major toccata, Peters III, No. 8, or that of the E minor prelude, Peters III, No. 10, there is revealed a whole world of interesting legato combinations. Many organists indeed have no idea that this division between the two hands indicates Bach's phrasing. They are even proud of themselves when they play these passages with one hand or in octaves with both hands, making one monotonous scale passage of them. If we follow the principle indicated by Bach's manner of writing his phrases, we see that he usually conceives 4 consecutive notes as grouped in such a way that the first is detached from the others by an imperceptible break, and belongs rather to the previous group than to the one that follows. Thus not but in this way, there is no sense of monotony in the legato. When we apply this principle, we are surprised with what clearness and ambition the passages come out. Consequently, we must play thus. Prelude in A minor, Peters II, No. 8. Toccata in D minor, Peters III, No. 3. One of the most instructive examples in this regard is the passage work in the subsidiary section of the B minor prelude. Grouped as a scale, it is always unsatisfactory. It only acquires life and form when we play it thus. The fresh and healthy prelude in C major again, Peters IV, No. 1, with a fine pedal solo, only loses its stiffness when we phrase it on this principle. We have the same experience with the other C major prelude, Peters II, No. 1. This phrasing, however, must never be obtrusively noticeable within the general legato. Its effect must be merely that of an agitation of the main contour. To bring out the phrasing by means of slurs and breath signs is much too clumsy a method. It should really be done by delicate and inexpressible means. It is doubtful whether, for the sake of variety, we should now and then play whole quaver or semi-quaver passages staccato. The phrasing of the fugue themes is still in dispute, though we are gradually getting further away from the extravagances of the earlier virtuosi, when they wrought such violence on Bach in the first joy of their virtuosity. A phrasing is fundamentally wrong that is not simple, and cannot be maintained throughout the whole piece, especially whenever the theme enters. Therefore any notes that interrupt the normal flow, and are denoted by characteristic leaps, must to some extent be taken out of the group and stand by themselves. Thus, Fugue in A minor, Peters II, No. 8. Fugue in G minor, Peters II, No. 4. Toccata in F major 3, Peters No. 2. The theme of the E-flat triple fugue is interesting, as the transformation it undergoes necessitate changes in its phrasing. First fugue. Second fugue. Third fugue. Only when phrased in this way do the themes of the second and third fugues become perfectly clear to the hearer, which is impossible if the notes are grouped evenly. When the same note is struck repeatedly, it should be sustained for only half its time value, with a pause for the remainder. The repeated notes are thrown into relief by the preceding and following slurs. Thus, Fugue in G major, Peters II, number 2, Fugue in C minor, Peters III, number 6. This rule holds good not only for the phrasing of the themes, but for the treatment of the repeated notes in general. It cannot be observed too strictly. Equally weighty is another rule. If a repeated note occurs on the paper by reason of the same note entering in another voice, the note must be held without repetition. It must not be heard as two notes because one voice takes it over from the other. In successive chords, the repeated notes are to be detached, and those moving in intervals are to be legato. In this way, the leading of the voices is brought out with extraordinary clearness. If one tries to translate these rules into practice, the simplest pieces become difficult. In order to realize the difficulties and the effect of playing in this strict style, the succession of chords in the middle section of the little E minor prelude, Peters III, number 10, should be studied. It is upon this plastic style of playing, not on ingenious registration and virtuosity, that the effect of Bach's organ works depends. But everything rests on seeming trifles, and we organists are much too modest and too indulgent to ourselves in this respect. Moreover, so few of us acquire a technique really adequate to Bach's demands. Many do not even acquire absolute precision of touch. Ornaments occur relatively seldom in the organ works, yet frequently enough for there to be plenty of opportunity for sins of thoughtlessness. It is always forgotten that the Bach trill, as Emmanuel expressly informs us, does not begin on the main note, but on the secondary note, and when it is long, always has a final turn. Thus the theme of the F minor fugue, Peters II, number 5, should be played either or two rapid trills are to be avoided on the organ. In the opening mordents of the Dorian toccata, Peters IV, number 4, and E minor fugue, Peters III, number 10, and the E flat prelude, Peters III, number 1, the ornaments must be played with a whole tone interval. The grace notes in the pedal part of the B minor prelude, Peters II, number 10, are to be played as quavers. Rust thought he recollected that in the autograph that unfortunately has disappeared, they were so noted. It is best, however, to separate two notes thus. There remains the question of the organ works for practical use. It is entirely a question of usage. Whoever uses Naumann's instructive collected edition, Breitkopf and Hartl, or Schreyer's collection, Hofmeister, Leipzig, to mention these alone, certainly gets a good deal of practical information, and no one should neglect to acquaint himself with the brilliant and profound observations and suggestions contained in these and similar works. For daily use, however, editions of this kind are not the best. The multitude of fingering, phrasing marks, slurs, tempi marks, and suggestions for registering give the works an overloaded look, and what is really essential remains after all unsaid. What is needed is not these very practical editions, so much as thorough separate studies of registration, manual changes, and the like. Here almost everything still remains to be done. An organist of the right kind will not take refuge in a practical edition, but will use an original edition and enter in it his own observations and experiments. On the structure of Bach's organ themes, again, and on the architecture of the works in themselves, and in relation to his clavier music, scarcely anything has been published as yet that goes to the root of the subject. The rhythm of the themes of organ fugues, it may be remarked, is much simpler than that of the clavier fugues. A few quite elementary syncopations apart, scarcely an accent falls on the weak part of a bar, the main accent always falls on the strong beat. Bach sees quite clearly that any other than this natural accent is impossible on the organ. For clavier and for orchestra he writes much more freely. Thus the object of transcribing clavier fugues for the organ is incomprehensible. No one who really understands the nature of Bach's organ works can listen to transcriptions of this kind. Further, the structure of the works is quite different. In the organ music, Bach works upon broader and simpler lines than in the clavier works. We seek in vain in the organ fugues for the subjective life, so rich in surprises, of the clavier fugues. The former are meant to work on a certain inner faculty of conception rather than on the immediate feeling, and to exhibit an idea in lofty simplicity. For this reason, Bach's clavier works sound restless on the organ. A satisfactory registration cannot be discovered for any of them. The difference between the clavier and the organ styles, in fact, cannot be better realized than by placing Bach's organ fugues by the side of his clavier fugues and studying the musical architecture of both in detail. There is, to be sure, one work for Bach's for the organ that stands on the borderline of the style he has laid down for his organ works in general. It is the A major fugue, Peters II, No. 3. Every organist can convince himself of this. If we play the theme legato without the articulation that gives character to it, it goes very lamely. If we play it as it is intended to be played, accenting the syncopations by cutting them short, then no matter how perfectly we play the piece, it has a notable restless effect. This is increased by the fact that the structural interest lies rather in the detail than in the whole, to say nothing of the further fact that sequences of thirds in the bass and a conclusion like that of this fugue are to be found nowhere else in the organ works of Bach. The interesting point is that we can prove that the theme of this exceptional fugue was originally conceived not for the organ, but for the orchestra. In its primary form it was written for the instrumental introduction to the cantata Tritt auf die Glaubensbahn. There is more to be said for the transition of organ work for the piano than for the reverse proceeding, since the piano, as Liszt said, is to music what engraving is to painting. It serves to multiply and disseminate works of art. When masters like Liszt, Saint-Saëns, Busoni, Réger, Philippe, d'Albert, Viana da Motta, and Ansorge undertake to arrange Bach's organ work for the pianoforte, the intelligent player has not only the advantage of learning works from which he would otherwise be barred, but the aesthetic pleasure of finding organ effects cleverly realized on the piano. Bach, who was himself passionately devoted to the art of transcription, would have been delighted with the pianoforte apostles of his organ gospel. There is danger, however, in going to excess. These transcriptions, even when they are made with the utmost art, cannot in the long run give complete satisfaction. The organ themes lose something on the pianoforte. The simple plan of the works has to be replaced by an artificial one, since the various degrees of strength in the organ tone cannot be reproduced even on the modern pianoforte. When this perception grows, men will some day discover what Bach himself experienced. It will look back on the age that delighted in transcriptions as on something long passed away, and its joy will not be in the transcription itself, but in the education it afforded. We must not allow these artistic transcriptions that often surpass the power of the average player to make us forget the old German domestic resource of playing the organ works from the original in arrangements for four hands, one player taking the manual parts and the other the pedal parts in octaves. End of chapter 14. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.